was kind of a normal morning, going down to the beach to see the guests leave.
What, if any, makeup was Miss Heard wearing?
Again, I'm not sure. If she wore makeup on the island, if it was very natural looking.
What, if any, injuries did you observe on Miss Heard?
I didn't observe any.
What, if any, injuries did you observe on Mr. Depp?
The marking across the bridge of his nose.
When did Miss Heard and Mr. Depp leave the island?
I believe they left that afternoon. The guests left in the morning, and I believe they left that afternoon.
After Miss Heard and Mr. Depp left the island, what did you do next?
Our usual, we go into the buildings and we break them down. We empty out the refrigerators, garbage, take all the perishables out of the house, straighten the place up, take the linens away, things like that.
What did you observe when you went through that process?
The island was as it was when they arrived. The only thing that was different was there was the liquid on the deck with a can, I believe, of mineral spirits or something there next to it, which had leaked out onto the deck, and then in the over the railing were paintbrushes and art supplies, paintbrushes, paint tubes, big jars that the paints are in, and those were all scattered in the bush.
Ms. Roberts, when is the first time you provided testimony about this incident in December 2015?
I believe it was for another case in May 2020.
Ms. Roberts, how often have you seen Mr. Depp drink alcohol on the island?
He goes through periods of time where he's been here and he doesn't drink, and it's non-alcoholic Bex or something like that. It varies. Sometimes he drinks when he's here, sometimes he doesn't.
How often have you seen Miss Heard drink alcohol on the island?
She drank wine. She drank wine with her drink was wine with dinner, maybe in the afternoon, but I know definitely with dinner.
Did you observe Miss Heard drinking alcohol when Mr. Depp was not drinking alcohol?
Objection leading. No, sustained is leading.
Okay. How often have you seen Mr. Depp drunk?
I would know he's a huge tolerance for alcohol. I haven't seen him passed out drunk or anything like that. So he drinks, but I haven't seen him passed out drunk.
Thank you, Ms. Roberts.
All right, cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Roberts, the salary you receive for managing the Bahama Island is approximately $10,000 a month, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and so that comes out to $120,000 a year? Correct? Okay, and you've been receiving that salary for many years, correct?
Correct.
Right. In fact, I think you got a raise to $10,010 in 2018. Do you remember that?
No, I don't know the exact number, but I know I get that a month.
Okay, and that's in addition to all of the expenses, correct? For running the island.
The expenses
Of running the island.
I get a salary every month. I'm not sure what you're asking me.
So the other people that are on the island, to the extent they work, they get a different salary, right?
Yes.
Okay, and all of the expenses you have, you talked about what you have to do to provision the island and everything else and run it. All of those expenses are paid separately, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and you said you've been managing this island for 15 years for Mr. Depp, is that correct?
Approximately, yes.
All right. Now, let's talk for a moment about those two videos that you testified to were part of the house. The first video was missing both the closet and the bathroom, correct?
I don't remember. I'd have to look again.
All right, and the second.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, I'm sorry, you didn't come through, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I think in the first video, the beads were the closet, and then there was the bathroom next to the closet.
Okay, that was the
You asked me?
that was the second video.
Oh,
Do you know who,
sorry.
do you know who took those videos?
Oh, I did.
Okay, when did you take those videos?
Oh, it would have to be, I'm not sure, a couple of years ago, maybe longer. I'm not sure.
Okay, did you take those videos for the UK trial?
I don't recall if it was for that.
Is there a reason that the closet and the bathroom were left out of the first video?
No, I stood in the house and did a circle around of the house.
Who asked you to make that video?
I'm not sure.
Was it Mr. Waldman? Adam Waldman?
I'm not sure. I don't know.
Can't recall?
I can't remember who asked me.
Okay.
No, I can't.
Okay, now the second video, that shows the closet, and then there's a door there. Would you agree that door opens up into a bathroom?
Next to the closet, yes.
Okay, and we don't have a video of the bathroom, correct?
I don't believe there was a video of the bathroom.
And no one asked you to make a video of the bathroom, correct?
Objection, relevance.
I'll overlook them.
Correct?
Oh, sorry. I'm not sure if anybody asked me to, I don't believe I videotaped the bathroom.
And my question was, and no one asked you to videotape the bathroom, correct?
Correct.
Okay, now, let's talk for a moment about the logistics of the island. So Mr. Depp's house, we've seen the inside of, and you said that the cafe was a 30-second walk, I think you said. How many yards?
I don't know. I walk it. It's just outside his house through the parking lot and walk away to the cafe.
Okay.
I
And
don't know.
okay, and the cafe is where Mr. Depp would regularly have his meals, correct?
Correct. All the guests would have their meals there.
Okay, including Mr. Depp and Ms. Hurd if she was there, and their children, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and
For
then
dinners, yes.
you were located on the other side of the island, correct? That's where you stayed?
Or I stay in the middle of the island, yes.
Okay, how far away is that from the cafe and the house?
Objection, compound.
I'll sustain the objection from him.
How far away is it from the house?
Where I stay,
Yes,
probably a 3-minute golf cart ride,
okay,
5-minute walk.
okay. And then when other guests come, I think you were talking about tents. Do they stay in tents?
No, the tents were erected for the wedding, and then they were dismantled. And sometimes we would erect them if we were asked to, just in case somebody wanted to stay there. But people didn't stay in the tents; they stayed in the buildings here.
Okay, so how much accommodation can you handle in the buildings for other guests? I'm not talking about the house, Mr. Depp's house. We've seen that. But how many people can actually be accommodated in the buildings?
We have 2-bedroom here on Brando Beach. We have a beach house, which has the bed in it, and then we have what we call a roundhouse, which has a bed in it as well.
Okay. Now, when Mr. Depp and Ms. Heard were visiting, whether they had the children there or not, typically, would you bring the meals to the cafe for each of the meals?
There's sometimes I would take them to the house, depending on where they wanted to eat.
Okay, and then typically, would you join them for the meal, or would you leave the meal and then come back and clean up afterwards?
Objection compound.
I'll sustain the objection.
All right, we'll take that one at a time. Typically, would you bring the meals to them?
Myself or one of the workers here would take the meals.
Okay, how often was it you that would take them?
How often? Maybe every other day, every day. It depended on how, if people were eating in their buildings or eating together.
All right, and would you stay and eat the meal with them, or would you leave?
If we were invited for dinner, we would all eat together. Usually we would take the food to the places and leave.
And then would you be called to come pick them up?
No, we would sometimes go back in the evenings on our own and clean up and turn some of the lights off. And sometimes we would do it in the morning, depending on what was happening.
Okay, so other than bringing the meals, and it could be you or somebody else, how often did you interact with Mr. Depp and Ms. Heard during the days when they were on the island?
On average, every day.
In what context other than delivering the meals and picking them up?
Oh, just seeing if anything was needed, if everything was all right, things like that. Generally passing them if they were walking or in the office or on the beach.
Okay. Now, would it be fair to say that you weren't spending 24/7 with them?
No, I didn't live with them, no.
Okay. And would it be fair to say that you don't know what they were doing during the times that you weren't passing them by or bringing meals?
Yes, unless they were on the beach.
Okay.
Then I would know. But
So you wouldn't know what happened, what would be taking place within the house, for example, when you weren't there, correct?
correct.
And you wouldn't know whether Mr. Depp was taking drugs, correct?
Correct.
And you wouldn't know whether Mr. Depp was drinking, correct?
I would only know by cleaning up.
And you wouldn't know, you wouldn't know from cleaning up necessarily whether it was Mr. Depp, Ms. Heard, or somebody else, would you?
Objection compound.
Overall, go ahead.
Please continue.
Unless I would know what it was by what was in the garbage or left out of who consumed or what was consumed, I would be able to know.
Okay. And you wouldn't know what arguments, if there were any, were taking place in that house behind closed doors, right?
Correct.
And you wouldn't know whether there was any kind of physical abuse that was taking place behind those closed doors, correct?
I wouldn't know. Correct.
Now, let me just take you for a moment to the December 2015 timeframe. How much advance notice are you typically given for when Mr. Depp and his entourage are going to arrive and for how long they're going to stay?
Objection compound.
All right, I'll sustain the objection.
All right, let's break it down. How much notice are you given when Mr. Depp and his entourage are coming?
It varies. Sometimes it's a couple of days, sometimes it's a couple of weeks.
So how much notice were you given in December of 2015 to who would be coming for Christmas on the Bahama Island?
I believe, sometime in November
Okay.
for
And
that trip.
And in November, how many people were you told were coming for Christmas on the island?
I don't recall how many people.
It was a lot more than Amber, Johnny, Lily Rose, Jack, and Lily Rose's boyfriend, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
In fact, it was Amber's parents, correct?
I believe so.
And it was Rocky Pennington and Josh Drew, correct?
I believe they were on the list.
And Rocky Pennington's parents?
Yes, I believe they were on the list.
Do you recall them canceling?
Objection, hearsay.
I recall,
How is that hearsay?
I'll overrule the objection. Go ahead.
I recall there was a change to the guests.
When did you learn of that?
I don't recall, maybe a couple weeks after, maybe it's beginning of December, maybe middle of December.
Do
I'm
you,
not sure.
do you recall if it was after December 15?
I don't recall.
Did you think that was a little strange that here these people were going to be at
Objection.
Christmas on the island and suddenly they cancel?
Objection, relevance.
I think it's highly relevant.
I'll sustain the objection. Next question.
What, if anything, were you told about why they canceled?
Objection, hearsay.
Party opponent admission.
We're doing
You
an
don't know.
accommodation for that.
Okay. Who told you that Amber's parents, her best friend and fiance, and her best friend's parents were suddenly canceling coming for Christmas on the island?
Objection, compound.
I'll allow that.
I don't know who told me, but I did receive I did receive information that they weren't coming and there were somebody else was coming instead.
And who was that somebody else coming instead?
It would be Alice and it would be Alice and Greg and the children and the nanny.
And they were coming later, right?
They would be joining. That I think was the words.
Okay. So on the December trip, you testified about a few arguments between Amber and Johnny, right? Do you recall that testimony?
Yes, I did.
Okay. You weren't present when Johnny sustained the gash on his nose, correct?
I wasn't there. No.
Okay. And you weren't present when the mess was made through the paints that you've described, correct?
No.
And so you don't know whether there had been a physical altercation and that led to throwing a paint can to try to slow down Johnny, right?
No, I just heard yelling in the house.
Okay, but that yelling in the house wasn't necessarily the same time, was it? You don't know, do you?
No, it was all the same. Okay, no.
Okay. Now, let's talk about the summer of 2013. Are you aware that Paul Bettany claims he's never met Amber?
Objection, relevance.
What's the
And calls for hearsay.
She testified that he was there on the island.
And calls for hearsay.
I can ask the question and see if she says.
All right, I'll allow the question. Go ahead.
Can you repeat it?
Are you aware that Paul Bettany has said that he never met Amber Heard?
No, I'm unaware. I didn't know that.
Well, let's stay on the summer of 2013 if we can. Do you have a recollection of Amber and Johnny, Lily Rose and Jack taking one final trip on the yacht that Johnny was going to be selling to J.K. Rowling?
I don't know what year that was. I don't know what year that was, but I do remember the yacht being sold.
If I tell you it was July of 2013, does that help refresh your recollection? July 9?
Yeah,
All right. Now,
it doesn't. I just know the yacht was sold.
okay, and you made arrangements, did you not, for a captain to captain the yacht and for them to go out on the yacht?
No, I didn't have any responsibility for the yacht and the crew on the yacht.
Okay. Do you have a recollection of being called because Lily Rose and Jack were upset and they wanted to leave the yacht and have a helicopter take them away?
Objection, hearsay, and compound.
I'm asking whether she has a recollection of this.
I'll allow the question.
Can you ask me again?
Do you have a recollection of Lily Rose and Jack being upset on the yacht and wanting to leave it immediately, so you arranged for a helicopter to come in to fly them away with Amber?
Objection, compound.
I'll allow it.
I don't know if Lily Rose and Jack were upset. I do know that I did arrange for transportation off the island at the time.
And in fact, Amber went with Lily Rose, correct?
It was Amber and her friend and Lily Rose.
Okay. And Jack decided at the last minute to stay back, correct?
I don't know if he decided last minute. He stayed.
Okay. Do you recall Lily Rose telling you that she was upset because her father was drinking and trying to hide it from him?
Objection, hearsay.
I'm asking whether she has a
I'll
recollection.
sustain the objection.
Okay. Then I'll ask the next one. Do you recall Mr. Depp passing out in the sand face first?
I recall that he was passed out on the beach. He was out on the beach. Yes.
Okay. And do you recall Jack calling you because he was concerned?
Objection, hearsay.
That's just asking if he called. I haven't asked what he said.
No, you did. I'll sustain the objection.
Okay. Do you have a recollection of Jack being present when Mr. Depp was passed out face first in the sand?
Yes.
And do you have a recollection of Jack being upset?
I don't have a recollection of him being upset.
Do you have a recollection of him being happy about it?
No, I didn't speak with Jack about it.
Okay. But you recall that Mr. Depp was passed out face first in the sand, correct?
Objection, asked and answered.
I'll sustain the objection. Next question.
All right, thank you. Let's talk about makeup for a moment. So you don't know what type of makeup regimen Amber uses every day, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And in fact, you don't know, you said at one point you're not sure, but it's a natural look. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And would you agree that there are a number of different types of makeup you can use that would still give you a natural look?
Objection calls for speculation.
I'll allow it.
I'm guessing there is, yes.
Okay. Okay. And there's sun in the Bahamas, right?
Most of the time.
Do you know what Amber wears for sunscreen?
I think it was at one point I had a brand Shishido or something like that was on the island that we provided.
And do you know whether Amber brought her own as well?
I don't know.
Do you know whether Amber had a skin condition?
I wasn't told.
But I take it you didn't ask.
No, I wouldn't have asked if somebody had skin condition.
Okay. The wedding. The wedding was planned at sunset, correct?
Correct.
And in fact, it went forward at sunset, correct?
It went earlier. It was earlier than sunset.
So your recollection is that there's no sunset pictures at the wedding?
There was sunset pictures.
Okay. So last couple questions. The makeup or not makeup, you were asked whether you observed any injuries on Amber in the December 2015 timeframe. Do you believe Amber would cover up bruises to hide them from the kids?
Objection calls for speculation.
I'll stay.
Do you have any understanding, based on your knowledge of Amber, whether she would try to cover up any bruises or cuts
Same
to
objection.
keep them from the kids?
I'll sustain the objection.
You said that you didn't believe that Amber was wearing much makeup, but you said she participated in a photo shoot in December 2015. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
Do you know whether Amber was wearing any makeup for a photo shoot?
I'm not sure the part that I saw. she
This
was in-
woman and her makeup questions, y'all.
Do
I
you know
I can't.
whether Amber would want to show bruises or cuts in a photo shoot?
Objection calls for speculation.
I'll sustain the objection.
I have no further questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, redirect.
Thank God. Thank God for that.
Ms. Roberts, how many times have you seen Mr. Depp consume drugs?
Objection leading.
All right, sustain.
Ms. Bernhoff asked you about Mr. Depp passed out on the beach. How would you describe Mr. Depp when you saw him on the beach?
He was passed out. I picked him up and brushed him up, and he sat. I left him underneath I believe he was in a hammock, and I believe he'd fallen asleep, or he was asleep, and the hammock had overturned. And I picked him up and brushed him off, and left him underneath the lanai with Jack.
Okay. No further questions.
All
Thank
right,
you,
is
Ms. Roberts.
subject to recall, Ms. Roberts.
Yes, potentially.
All right.
So
Ms. Roberts, since you're subject to recall, did not discuss your testimony with anybody and just did not watch anything about this case, okay, ma'am?
Okay, thank you very
All
much.
right, thank you. All right, your next witness.
Dr. Shannon Curry. She'll come right up.
Dr.
Shannon Curry,
Can you, is it C-U-R-R-Y?
Curry.
Okay, thank you.
That one attorney always gets up there and badgers witnesses about makeup and do they know what brand she uses and how she uses it. Like, come on. She didn't even know what brand she uses holding up Milani makeup that didn't come out for another year.
Good morning, Dr. Curry.
Good morning.
I'm Wayne Dennison. Could you state your full name for the record?
Shannon Curry.
What do you do for a living?
I am a clinical and forensic psychologist.
What's your educational background?
I started college at Georgetown University. I then transferred to the University of California, Irvine, where I received my bachelor's degree in psychology and social behavior. I completed my master's degree in psychology at Pepperdine University. I went on to complete my doctoral degree in clinical psychology at Pepperdine University, which included several training rotations at different practicum sites. Those are essentially clinical rotations we do to learn various types of psychology. You learn how to do psychological assessment, counseling, etc., and you do that in a variety of different settings. And then I completed a year-long doctoral internship at an American Psychological Association accredited doctoral internship. You do this year before you get your degree, and that was at Tripler Army Medical Center. It's traditionally a military internship. They did admit 2 civilians. I was lucky enough to be one of them. I then completed 2 years of postdoctoral training at Hawaii State Hospital, a locked forensic psychology facility, and that's where you essentially have individuals with severe mental illness who have committed crimes.
Have you done any additional coursework or education?
I have. So after I completed my doctorate and my postdoctoral training, I obtained it's called a postdoctoral Master of Science degree in clinical psychopharmacology. That is for partial fulfillment of prescription privileges, meaning that it's part of what we need to be able to prescribe medications as a psychologist, because psychologists don't traditionally prescribe, and we can do that with certain military jurisdictions in other states. I also obtained advanced training in the Gottman method of couples therapy. I completed all 3 levels of training, and then I'm also a Gottman educator for several workshops involving helping parents learn how to prepare to bring their baby home and helping couples without serious problems improve their relationships.
What's the Gottman method?
The Gottman method is a highly research-based method of couples therapy. It's very structured, so different than what many people expect when they think about couples therapy. I always tell my clients I don't want them to come in, just tell each other all their problems, and then have an awkward, silent drive home. In this therapy, they come in, they complete a really structured assessment in the beginning. So they complete a bunch of questions. It gives me a ton of information about their relationship before we even get started, and really identifies the areas we're going to target with structured interventions during each session. I think of it almost like a class.
Did you get, in the course of your education, any specialized training?
Any what?
Specialized training?
I did. So my internship specifically was dedicated to essentially working with post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic stress. A lot of my training has been with psychological assessment and testing. And then my training during practicum and then in my postdoctoral work was dedicated to working with trauma populations and also conducting forensic psychological assessments. Oftentimes, forensic psychological assessments actually refers to doing testing and an interview and a couple other things for purposes related to law. So it's the application of psychology to the courts, to legal issues. And sometimes that also involves doing assessments for the military to determine whether somebody has sustained a mental disability after combat.
You indicated that you did some work at Tripler. What's Tripler and what's the work you do?
So Tripler Army Medical Center is a hospital in Honolulu, Hawaii. If anybody's ever gotten to have a vacation in Hawaii, it's a giant pink building there. And it's one of the top training sites for military psychologists. I was very, very lucky to be able to train there. They have wonderful funding and a lot of new research going on, particularly for PTSD, but really for all areas of mental health. While I was there, I did rotations in family psychology, so doing family therapy. I worked with children, but I also did a neuropsychology rotation, learning really the ins and outs of advanced psychological assessment, identifying not just mental issues, mental illness, but also traumatic brain injuries after trauma, and doing those PTSD evaluations, and then also working with service members who were struggling with a whole host of issues, military stressors, normal life stressors, and then also those who sustained tremendous trauma from combat.
Do you still continue to work with the military?
I do, actually. Our practice, my practice is very focused on military service members, veterans, and their families.
What work have you done in prior litigation matters?
Well, most of my litigation, if we're talking about civil work, that has mostly been reports. So this is my first time testifying in a civil matter. The majority of my forensic work has been in criminal law or providing psychological assessments, and then I produce a really methodical report, which is typically reviewed by a judge, and a determination is made, or usually there's a settlement beforehand.
Do you work in connection with any particular courts?
I do. So I'm actually not sure if I'm on the list anymore in Honolulu, but I am a certified forensic evaluator for the state of Hawaii, which means that I have been appointed by the court to conduct evaluations for matters that are presented. And then I'm also on the list of forensic evaluators in several courts in Southern California. And then I'm contracted by the military, the Department of Defense, now and again for evaluations of PTSD from service members.
Okay, you mentioned PTSD a couple of times now.
Yes.
What are you referring to there?
So PTSD is a mental illness. It can develop after a person has been exposed to a traumatic event. And our diagnostic statistical manual, the DSM, is sort of the authoritative manual of mental illnesses. It's considered our Bible of mental illness. We go there for diagnoses. And according to that, there's a specific type of trauma that a person must experience for them to be able to qualify for a diagnosis of PTSD. And that's an event that is life-threatening. It can also involve sexual assault, and you can experience that either directly, but you can also be traumatized if you've seen it happen to somebody else, or if it's happened unexpectedly or violently to somebody close to you, a family member or a friend. And then there's also a provision for people who are first responders. If they're encountering really traumatic information regularly, that qualifies as a trauma. Now, there are a number of symptoms that can develop.
Sure. We'll talk about that some
Okay.
more. Do you hold any credentials relevant to the work that you do?
Well, I am a licensed psychologist
Where?
in California and Hawaii.
Okay, and any other certifications or other credentials?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head, other than the training with the Gottman method of couples therapy.
Okay. Have you worked with the Hawaii Department of Courts and Corrections?
Yes, I have.
In what capacity?
Well, so that I guess would be a credential. So I am a certified forensic evaluator for the state of Hawaii.
In connection with your doctorate, was there a research component?
There was. So would you like me to tell you about it?
Yes, please.
Okay. So I conducted a research study while I was at Pepperdine completing my doctorate. It's called a dissertation. So when you're obtaining your doctorate, you contribute something to the scientific field that you're in. And typically that involves doing what we call novel science. So you're doing an experiment, you're finding out new information and helping the field progress. So I did research in Peru, and I was essentially looking at the effectiveness of a therapy intervention there for kids who were growing up in this community called Ayacucho, which was exposed to 20 years of guerrilla warfare, the longest guerrilla war in the history of the world. And there were a lot of issues in that community, tremendous trauma. And my research was around finding interventions that were really effective for that community.
Where do you work now?
I work for the Curry Psychology Group.
What does the Curry Psychology Group do?
We're a multi-specialty mental health center, so we have neuropsychologists who do testing for kids. We have therapists, individual therapists, couples therapists, family therapists. We even have a meditation teacher. We basically try to meet the needs of our community, and we highly specialize in working with military personnel and their families.
Who's the Curry and Curry Psychology Group?
I'm Dr. Curry.
How many people work for you?
As of right now, I believe it's 13.
How long have you been doing this kind of work?
For about 15 years.
How much of your therapy practice focuses on treating individuals?
I would say about half of it is individuals, half is couples.
Okay. Do you do any training of students?
I do.
What's that?
So we have several unlicensed professionals at our office, and they're earning their additional hours so that they can get licensed. So they're able to see clients, and then I meet with them regularly to supervise them, discuss their cases, provide them with information about different diagnoses, interventions, and treatment methods.
How did you get involved in this case?
I was contacted by Ms. Camille Vasquez, one of the attorneys for Mr. Depp.
Okay. And what was the nature of the contact?
Ms. Vasquez called me and indicated that she might be interested in having me meet the legal team so that I could discuss my expertise and possibly provide my opinions related to the matter.
What were you asked to provide expert opinion on?
So initially, my role that I understood at the time was to review the case materials and provide my opinions regarding anything that I noticed that was consistent or even inconsistent with the psychological science that exists today on intimate partner violence in Mr. Depp and Ms. Heard's relationship.
You used a phrase there, intimate partner violence. What are you talking about?
So there are a multitude of different definitions depending on the source or the state. But essentially, intimate partner violence is abuse. It could be physical, psychological, and it's from one partner to another in an intimate relationship.
Did your role in this case evolve over time?
Yes, it shifted. So I was retained at the end of January 2021, and then had just barely begun to review the documents. The case was postponed, and then in October 2021, I was asked by counsel to provide a psychological evaluation of Ms. Heard.
Were you ever asked to do a psychological evaluation of Mr. Depp?
No.
Okay.
What types of documents did you consider in this analysis?
So I reviewed quite a few documents as part of my evaluation. That included all of the case documents, Ms. Heard's medical records by Dr. Kipper, her prior mental health treatment records. I believe I reviewed records from Dr. Amy Banks, Dr. Bonnie Jacobs, Dr. Connell Cohen, and also a significant portion of my review involved notes from Nurse Erin Filati at the time, Erin Borum, who spent a significant time with Ms. Heard and her direct company. I also reviewed exhibits, quite a few audio recordings, a video recording, several video recordings, and possibly photographs. I might be getting them confused. And multiple witness statements, testimony, and declarations.
Did there come a time when you met directly with Ms. Heard?
Yes, I did. So in conducting my evaluation, I met with Ms. Hurd on 2 separate dates, December 10th and December 17th, 2021.
Approximately how much time have you spent with Ms. Hurd?
So the evaluation, we spent 12 hours directly with one another. However, there were more hours involved in the evaluation with some breaks. So we spent 7 hours together on the first day, December 10th. Not necessarily together because there was a 1 hour lunch break and about a half hour with breaks split up through the day. And then on the 17th, we spent a little more than 8 hours in the evaluation from start to finish, with a 1 hour break and another half hour of breaks distributed throughout the day.
As a result of the work that you performed, did you form any opinions with respect to Ms. Hurd?
I did.
What were those opinions?
The results of Ms. Hurd's evaluation supported 2 diagnoses: borderline personality disorder and histrionic personality disorder.
What is a diagnosis?
A diagnosis is a way that that psychologists, psychiatrists, anybody in the mental health field thinks about a disorder. It helps us to communicate a set of symptoms that a person is experiencing, and along with that set of symptoms, it tells other professionals a lot about how those symptoms might have developed, how that person might behave, perceive the world. It also drives treatment. The real purpose is to determine what sort of interventions will be most effective for the person.
Previously, you made reference to, I think you call it the DSM-5. What's
Yes.
that?
So the DSM-5, that stands for the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, version 5. And that contains every diagnosis we use in mental health. And it's the authoritative manual of mental diagnoses.
Is performing diagnoses something you typically do in your line of work?
Yes.
So you referenced 2 personality disorders. What's a personality disorder?
To understand a personality disorder, I think it can be helpful first to kind of define personality. So personality, something we take for granted, but these are the traits, the characteristics, the way we think, we feel, and we act that make us who we are. And these traits are pretty stable over time and across situations. We might, be sure to mind our P's and Q's when we're meeting somebody new, but overall, if somebody were to describe us or if we were to describe ourselves, we have a pretty good sense of who we are. Sometimes an easy way to think of it is imagining how you might describe a brother or sister or a child if you have children. Their personalities are pretty clear to you. A personality disorder is some sort of dysfunction in those enduring traits. So as opposed to other types of mental illness, when you think about something like depression, that's episodic. It comes and it goes. And when it's treated with medication, it can pretty much be completely mitigated or minimized in a person's life, and their personality is still there, separate from the depression. When we have a personality disorder, there are going to be disturbances in several different areas that are visible in almost all different facets of their life.
Is there a manner in which personality disorders are commonly diagnosed?
Yes, so they can be diagnosed if in a treating environment. Treating psychologist or a therapist or a psychiatrist simply does a diagnostic interview, which involves assessing multiple areas of a person's history back down through
I'm
childhood.
going to stop you for a second.
Yes.
What's a treating environment?
Sometimes I'll slip into these words, I apologize. So a treating environment in therapy, if somebody's going in for treatment, the mental health provider will ask them questions to find out what sort of symptoms they've experienced and what sort of things have occurred in their life that might be consistent with these disorders or rule out these disorders, prove that there's no reason for these disorders to be considered. They might also pay attention to their observations of the client over time and new information the client provides them. The most reliable way, however, to ever come about a diagnosis really is through a comprehensive psychological assessment. And I might use the words assessment, examination, testing interchangeably. They all mean the same thing. It's combining information from multiple different sources. One main source is psychological testing using validated objective measures. That means that they've been tested, they've been shown to be accurate for testing what you want to test, and in the environment you're testing. So there are measures specific for court environments where someone might respond differently. You integrate that with the same interview I was telling you that people would do for therapy. We do that as well. And then in a courtroom setting, you're going to look at all the legal records, all of those documents, corroborating information to sort of check your hypotheses that may be developing, and also check against the examinee's statements to confirm whether you have enough evidence of a certain diagnosis.
So what's a clinical interview?
A clinical interview is a very comprehensive interview. It includes a person's entire life history, as well as very specifically looks at any symptoms they might have. This can start as far back as birth. You might find out if there were any issues with their delivery, any genetic issues, any intellectual issues. How did they do? What was their home life like? How was discipline handled? What's their relationship with their primary caregivers? Were they raised by an aunt, an uncle, their parents? How many siblings do they have? How do they get along with their siblings? How many times did they have to move? Was there any abuse? Did they have any really significant life experiences that come to mind when they think about their childhood? How were they as a student? Did they need special services? Did they get in trouble at school? And you do this, you continue on high school. What were their hobbies? Did they play sports? How many friends did they have? Did they have any trouble keeping those friendships? And you get into adulthood. Did they go to college? Did they not go to college? How come? What sort of jobs have they held? How did those jobs go? How did they end? That's always an important question. What sort of romantic relationships have they been involved in? How do they identify sexually, culturally? Let's see, what else? What sort of symptoms have they experienced? You go through the entire gamut of some of the main symptoms. You might screen for depression, any disorganized thinking. That means thinking that isn't necessarily in touch with reality, and any current distress they may be having today.
How did you conclude that Ms. Hurd suffers from the personality disorders that you identified?
So there was information that supported it from multiple sources. I conducted testing, including one of the main tests that I used. She obtained scores that were consistent with those diagnoses. And then I also, there was evidence of those diagnoses in her records and in her self-report.
All right, council, why don't we just go ahead and pause for a second while we go ahead and take our morning recess. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we'll go ahead and take our 15-minute morning recess. Do not discuss the case and do not do any outside research, okay?
Your Honor, when would you like to reconvene?
Give me a moment, sir. And doctor, since you're on the stand now, do not discuss your testimony with anybody to include the attorneys at this point, okay? All right, let's go ahead and we'll come back at 11:45, okay? All right, thank you.
Your Honor.
Okay, we're on break. Let's hash this out. How fucking pissed do y'all think Amber is right now? I'm also loving that the judge has a whole coffee gallon jug on her table. I feel that to my very core. I agree. I think she's big mad. She looked like she was trying to keep her cool for sure. If you're watching on TikTok live, if you go to the Sojo Files YouTube channel, you can join the live chat. I'm not watching the live chat on TikTok. It's easier for me to manage the live chat on YouTube. So if you're currently watching this live on TikTok, I encourage you to go join the live on YouTube. The Sojo Files is the name of the channel, and that way we can all have a group discussion. Yeah, she's having a mega pint of coffee. How do we feel about the house or the island manager this morning? And also, why does the female attorney always get up there and badger the witness about makeup? Do you know what she uses? Do you know what brand she uses? Do you know how she uses it? When she uses it? Like, ma'am, you don't even know what brand she uses. Let me remind you of Amica cream and the Milani debacle. Can y'all imagine what she's saying on this break right now? Like, someone give her a cigarette for their own safety. I love that the island manager looked like me. She like rolled out of bed, had a white sheet in the background, and was like, let's go. Like, what do you want to know? Someone I saw was asking about why they kept asking her about her pay. They're wanting it to seem like, oh, she makes, $10,000 a month taking care of this island. So maybe she has some loyalty to Johnny because he pays her so much to take care of the island. That's where they were going with that. Is the makeup the trial sponsor? That is so funny. Yeah, that female attorney is, God bless her, worse than objection. And she was like throwing a hissy fit every time they objected. It's their job. At least they did it a reasonable amount. Can you really get mad? This doctor is a one-stop shop, y'all. She is incredible. Yes. So all of the evidence, they have what's called a discovery. All of that is hashed out and traded back and forth well before they get here. So they know what each side is going to be presenting during the trial. I'm still not over this. The more I watched it, the funnier it got. I don't know if y'all noticed this yesterday, but during the live, I turned my face camera off. I actually had to get up and walk out of the room, and I joined the live chat from my iPad because I could not pull my shit together when he objected, and the judge was like, you asked the question. I was howling yesterday. Yes, Amber Heard's team would already know what she's going to say. Yes. For the most part, at least, yes. The doctor is a witness for Team Depp. Her team is, yes, they're as fumbly as they seem. It's pretty bad. I mean, I'm annoyed because obviously sometimes when you ask a question, like you'll see a witness give an answer and then you'll see it make the attorney change their course of questioning and they might be looking for something at that point. But I've never seen an attorney take that much time to find what they're looking for and not know the evidence. Take notes on your evidence, tab the pages. They're very I mean, I was really dogging the Duggar attorneys during the Duggar trial with their pretrial motions and everything. It was shockingly bad, in my personal opinion. And yeah, this, whew. Okay, Christina, I say this all the time. So normally I cover Arkansas cases that did not get attention that I think that they needed. I got one back here that we'll cover. Season 2 of the podcast is going to be on a case that got honestly no attention. Not even local media picked it up. And it's a case that I think is making a murder case. And so, yeah, it's definitely an issue for sure. It's just the way the world works. Some cases get picked up and get attention and some don't. And the sociologist in me is very interested in this case just because of how society attaches a gender to abuse. And so I'm very interested in what's going on with this case. But I swear I normally do not cover celebrity cases. It's just Duggar was an Arkansas case. And this I have just a sociological interest in. How much do I think this whole case cost? A lot of money. Oh man, a lot of money. I totally understand this comment. 1000%. I lost a family member as a result of domestic violence. It was a case very much similar to this one. So it's very interesting to me, like I said, from a sociological aspect, that of course, like we're post Me Too movement, and that was a fantastic movement. It was started by very courageous women, brave enough to speak the truth and give people courage and empowerment to tell their stories. And it was phenomenal. But on the same note, you have people that will take advantage of that social climate and emotional and mental, there's people out there that have really been through some terrible things. And when they hear cases like this, it tugs on their heartstrings and, ride or die crew. But unfortunately, yeah, there are people that will play on those emotional and mental aspects, and people have to be aware of those things. I think as a society, lots of people have a hard time believing that a man can be an abuse victim. That's absolutely crazy. Being a victim knows no age, no gender, no skin color, no religious background, no socioeconomic class. Anyone can be a victim. Anyone. How did this case start? Okay, so let me give you just the quick Sojo summary rundown. Johnny Depp, Amber Heard, they meet on the set of a movie. They get married. They're married for 15 months. They get divorced. Amber Heard participates in a Washington Post op-ed opinion editorial piece, and she talks about how she is a survivor of domestic abuse, and she says all these things. And long story short, Johnny gets fired from Pirates and Harry Potter, and she's getting sued for defamation, and that's what brought us to this situation here today. Why is it being held in Virginia? It's being held in Virginia because the Washington Post has an online server, and that online server is hosted out of Virginia. So that gave them grounds to file the lawsuit in Virginia. And then they liked some of the laws in Virginia, and that's how we ended up in Virginia. This right here, she's like, tell the world, Johnny. Tell the world, I, Johnny Depp, a man, am a victim of domestic violence. Tell the world and see how many people believe you. Joke's on her. She underestimated the public big time. Big time. I liked the island manager too. She was like a no fucks given kind of person. Like, I'm not going to ask her about her skin condition, and she's just chilling. I was here for it. I love people like that because I think it humanizes them. It makes them more trustworthy. I think you want witnesses that are relatable, believable, trustworthy, or like this doctor right here where they're just so legit as fuck that of course you're going to listen to what they have to say. I will say in some cases, you do have to be aware that just because someone is an expert witness doesn't mean that they're telling you everything correctly. I'm not saying this about her. I'm saying in general, just keep this in mind for future cases that we discuss. Like a criminal case, for example, the defense will hire an expert witness. That doesn't always mean that you should believe everything they say. So just keep that in mind for future cases that we discuss. Obviously, I think this woman's clearly very legit. Samantha coming into the comment section. The party has officially started. You are absolutely right, Tammy. The joke is on her. Kelly. No one's judging. Typos are welcome here. Big facts. I would love to be a fly on the wall for meetings between her and her attorneys, especially after yesterday. We are fluent in typo. Also, Siri is a backstabbing bitch and she types the wrong stuff for me all the time. Fluent in that. Today's testimony did start this morning, definitely better than this morning. We've heard from the island manager. She basically took care of Johnny's island, all that good stuff. She was great. Not much, you didn't miss too much, except for, of course, Amber Heard's female attorney badgering her about what kind of makeup and sunscreen and skincare that Amber used. And now we have this doctor who's clearly brilliant and highly qualified. Okay, Kelly, if it makes you feel better, I didn't even notice the typo. I would not have put you on blast, Scout's honor, had I noticed the typo. I did not notice the typo. I'm so sorry. Yes, we are currently on morning break. So normally when you're attending a trial, they have a morning break, quick stretcher, 15 minutes. Then you have your lunch break, and then they'll do an afternoon break as well. So it's just kind of so everybody can stretch, take a breather, or people like me, you're not allowed phones in typically here. So I'll have to like run 2 blocks to my car, send out the updates, and then run back in. So yes, we're on our 15-minute morning break now. Then we'll have lunch, and then they'll do an afternoon break. Okay, so like in a criminal case, if they're calling an expert witness, they'll call their witness up to the stand. They'll ask all these questions about their education, their work, all the things that you need to know about who they are, what they do, why they're trustworthy and qualified. And then they'll say, you know, that this is an expert witness. Now, they kind of went into all that, but then they asked her for diagnoses and she went into it. So
Ready for the jury?
we're back. Let's get this situation going. We are on week 3, day 2 of week 3. So 9. Samantha is always dropping the good comments, y'all. I swear. This comment right here. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. But I'm happy that you're safe now, Haley.
All right, you have your seat. And your next question, sir?
TikTok again, if you want to join the live chat, YouTube, the Sojo Files, and
Dr.
join us
Before
there.
the break, you were talking about some of the factors that you considered in determining that Ms. Heard suffers from personality disorders. And one of them, I think the last one you said before you left, was self-report. What do you mean by that?
So the self-report would be things that Ms. Heard indicated to me specifically. So there were a couple of characteristics that she noted in her self-report that were consistent with these personality disorders. The first was actually my own behavioral observations of her based on her self-report. So one of the hallmark characteristics of histrionic personality disorder is sort of a overly dramatic presentation. We call this impressionistic speech. So it tends to be very flowery. It uses a lot of descriptive words like magical, wonderful, and it can go on for quite some time, and yet it really lacks any substance. So at the end, you're left wondering what was just said or what the answer is to the actual question. So that occurred a number of times. And it also represented the quick shifts you'll see between emotions. So she would suddenly be one way, and then she would become very animated or very sad. And when people are displaying these emotions with this personality disorder, there's a sense of shallowness to it. People who are observing them will feel like it's almost play acting, and they might not be able to put their finger on it. But part of it is because of the rapidness with which the person can switch emotions, and also the lack of substance. They don't really refer to, I feel this way. They might describe emotions, they might describe events, but very rarely, and Ms. Hurd did not say, I feel vulnerable. She never really indicated a vulnerable feeling of her own. Then the substance of her self-report. So when I was asking her information about her history.
We're going to ask more about that later. I'm just trying to get a sense of what a self-report was.
Oh, okay.
What psychological tests did you perform?
Okay, so psychological tests, I'll just go in order. So first of all, I asked her a couple questions from something called the mini mental status exam. That's really just a fancy way of saying that I wanted to make sure that she was alert and oriented to, we call it person, place, and time. That means she knew who she was, she knew who I was, she knew where we were, and she knew the date. That way I can ensure that she's able to participate in the evaluation and understand what's happening. I then administered something called the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory 2. The 2 means that it's the second edition. And this is something we call an objective measure. So it asks 567 questions or statements, and the person either agrees or disagrees with them, how much the statement represents them. And this test has been around since 1943. There are more than 10,000 studies showing that it is appropriate for determining somebody's personality traits. It measures all of those things I sort of mentioned, how a person thinks, feels, and behaves in multiple different aspects of their lives. It also measures very accurately any signs of mental illness or dysfunction. And the reason I also really like this test, whenever you're using a test for an evaluation that's going to be used in a forensic setting, people have a lot of incentive to present themselves in a way that's going to benefit their case. And they may want to look like they're sicker than they really are. They may want to look much healthier than they really are. And some of those incentives, they may not even realize that they're intending to do that. So it can be conscious or unconscious, but you really need to have a test that can check for that. And the MMPI-2 has a set of validity scales, we call them. These are scales that measure really the truthfulness and accuracy with which a person is approaching the test. And these scales on this particular test have been so well researched over many decades that they've become very nuanced, and they can tell us a lot about if somebody's, for instance, exaggerating. Are they elevating one of the scales that shows that they're exaggerating on purpose? Are they exaggerating in a manner that's more like a cry for help? Are they exaggerating in a manner that's clever and sophisticated or more obvious? And then the same exact thing goes for trying to minimize symptoms. We have a number of scales that can show us all the different, if somebody's trying to say they're the most wonderful person on earth, or if they're just trying to deny problems, and if they're doing that again in a very clever way or more of an obvious way. So that test was my choice for this case. There's one other reason I'd like to add, is that part of my evaluation was, one of the reasons was to assess whether Ms. Hurd has post-traumatic stress disorder, which I told you about earlier, as a result of the incidents that she's alleged occurred by Mr. Depp. And that's a really tough disorder to find out if somebody's faking it or not. It's one of the most easily faked disorders. Most of us know what it feels like to feel anxious. And a lot of people have seen war movies and movies that depict somebody having PTSD. In fact, some research has shown that if you give someone a diagnostic checklist and said, show that you have PTSD, they can do it 96% of the time with someone on the street. So you really need a test that's very sensitive to that. And the MMPI-2 has been shown in multiple studies to be excellent at detecting those attempts.
Okay, you keep using MMPI-2, that's the abbreviation that you folks use for,
I'm sorry if I hadn't said that. That's the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory.
what other psychological testing did you perform?
So I also performed the clinician administered PTSD scale, -5, and that -5 links it to the diagnosis for PTSD in our current diagnostic manual, the 5th version. To do that test, you first administer something called the Life Events Checklist. And the Life Events Checklist, both of these tests, by the way, were developed by the National Center for PTSD with the Department of Veterans Affairs. But the Life Events Checklist lists 16 different very stressful life events that people can go through that are often can be associated with developing PTSD. And then it also has a 17th item that you can fill in if you feel like you've been through something really difficult that wasn't included. Now, I like to also add something called the Life Events Checklist 5 interview, which digs a little bit deeper into the person's childhood as well to find out if there's so many different things that can be difficult growing up. And also, it's very important that you have the person determine which of the events they've listed, let's say they have a number of different types of traumas, which one do they feel like was the most traumatic for them? Which one still causes them to feel distressed when they talk about it? And sometimes they can't just identify one. And then that leads to your next decision. So if they have multiple different similar types of events, like seeing combat, then you might use that as the worst one, the multiple similar. So that looks like you describe an anchor, we call it, to do the testing. And we would maybe describe the anchor as the worst of my combat experience, okay? Now, if somebody had multiple different traumas from different times in their life, like childhood abuse, and then went to combat and had some horrible things happen there, you would do the clinician-administered PTSD scale test, the one that comes after. You do one for the childhood event and a separate one for the adulthood event.
Does this clinician-administered PTSD scale have handy abbreviation?
It does. We'll call it the CAPS-5. That's actually what it goes by.
Okay. How common is the use of the MMPI-2 in your profession?
The MMPI-2 is actually the most commonly used assessment worldwide by mental health professionals and in forensic settings for the court.
Why do you use it?
I used it for that purpose and for its excellent validity in those settings across genders, across ethnicities, for different reasons. And when I keep saying validity, by the way, what I mean is accuracy, and I'll try to work that in, but then also for detecting the accuracy with which a person reports PTSD.
Is that scaled in some way?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Does that make use of a scale in some way?
The MMPI, do you mean specifically for PTSD?
Yes.
There's actually a combination of scales you want to look for. You would never make the diagnosis just based on one scale alone, or even on the test alone. You integrate other data.
How did you administer the MMPI-2 to Ms. Hurd?
I provided her the test on an iPad. She essentially had her own little desk area and then an iPad. She hits start, it provides her with the instructions, and then it gives her 567 statements in order. For each one, she taps true or false.
What did you learn about Ms. Hurd from the results of the MMPI-2?
Quite a bit. I wrote up a 25-page interpretation outline. It has numerous scales. So one of the reasons I like this measure so much is that it can tell you so much about multiple different traits and tendencies and mental issues. One of the primary things I learned was that she had a very sophisticated way of minimizing any personal problems. I also learned that she tends to, well, there were a number of characteristics that were consistent with the eventual diagnoses, but some of the primary characteristics, and I'm going to try to condense 25 pages here, were essentially externalization of blame, tending to have a lot of inner hostility that is attempted to be controlled, a tendency to be very self-righteous, but to also deny that self-righteousness and to judge others critically against these sort of high standards for moral value, but also to deny doing that, essentially to claim that one is very non-judgmental and accepting, and yet very full of rage, really. And these aren't facts, but her scores essentially correlated, so they were consistent with other people who obtained these scores who have been shown through many, many, many studies to have these very specific traits. So externalization of blame, a lot of inner anger and hostility, sometimes that anger among these groups with similar scores, these people might have that anger kind of explode out at times. They tend to be very passive aggressive. They may be self-indulgent, very self-centered. They could use manipulation tactics to try to get their needs met, very needy of attention, acceptance, approval. They tend to distance people who are close to them. Initially, they may seem very charming. They're very socially sophisticated, actually. That was a major component on there. They have a capacity to kind of offer some of their faults, but in a way, but only the ones that people think of lightly and can all relate to. And so they can present as very fair and balanced, but in actuality, they really might be very judgmental of others and unaware of problems in their behavior and their thinking.
So after you provide the examination via the iPad, what do you do?
So once they've completed the test, you can have it scored by the computer immediately. It's a very, very complex test to interpret, but right away you get a list of what's called critical items. And these are just some, a couple of the items, the statements that are presented that are more clearly symptom-based. And I always follow up with the examinee. Some of these might have to do with suicide. Some of them might have to do with other symptoms that you just like to get a little bit more information on, because sometimes an examinee might tell you they're completely fine when you're doing your interview with them and that they have no symptoms. And then when they take the test, it says that they're having trouble sleeping, or they struggle with nausea all the time, or they feel very anxious. And so you want to follow up on that.
What's a code type?
A code type, let me think of how to explain this very, very simply. So the main scales, and I keep referring to scales, these are just the main scores that come up on this test. We can refer to them as codes. And when I was saying that Ms. Hurd's scores could be compared to certain groups of people that had been researched before to obtain similar scores, the research has shown that certain people will have certain scores that kind of spike on this, okay? And so all of those traits that I was describing, those are traits that are found in these code types. So it means that score number two was high, and score number 6 was high. And so if we have those two scores were both high, then that's a 2-6 code type. And these code types.
What code type was Ms. Hurd?
Ms. Hurd had the clearest code type was 3-6, but then she also had some other code types that were less significant.
What characteristics are associated with the 3-6 code type?
So a 3-6 code type, a lot of that anger is expressed in this code type. There can be actually a lot of cruelty, usually with people who are less powerful. Actually, when you see this code type, you want to, if you can, to follow up with subordinates, coworkers, people who may have observed their behavior more closely. The 3-6 code type is very concerned with their image, very attention-seeking, very prone to externalizing blame to a point where it's unclear whether they can even admit to themselves that they do have responsibility in certain areas. A lot of suppressed and denied anger, that the anger is very present, will explode out, and a lot of issues in their close relationships.
How does Ms. Hood's code type fit in with your overall opinion as to personality disorders?
Well, this might be an appropriate time to describe a little bit about these personality disorders, because I think what you'll hear is that there's a lot of consistency there. So borderline personality disorder is a disorder of stability. It's instability, and it's instability in personal relationships. It's instability in their emotions. It's instability in their behavior, and it's instability in their sense of self and their identity. And that instability is really driven by this underlying terror of abandonment. So one of the key features also of this disorder, and all of it is like pistons of an engine kind of firing off and igniting one another. But when somebody is afraid of being abandoned by their partner or by anybody else in their environment, and they have this disorder, they'll make desperate attempts to prevent that from happening. And those desperate attempts could be physical aggression, it could be threatening, it could be harming themselves. But these are behaviors that are usually very extreme and very concerning to the people around them. The anger is typically what, sadly, it's counteracted, right? So the thing these people fear most is being abandoned, but over time, the anger, the explosive anger that they show when somebody is needing space, or when somebody's really not doing anything wrong, because a lot of times they read into things that they perceive as being a slight to them or being somebody intending to harm them that actually isn't happening. They'll exaggerate it, and they'll explode. They'll react in this heightened manner that is just exhausting for their partners. Oftentimes their partners will try to make them happy at first and really allow themselves to be a punching bag, thinking that they can somehow solve this problem, that somehow they can make this better. And eventually it just overwhelms them. Histrionic personality disorder is very
Before we
similar.
move on,
Okay,
are you familiar with the term emotional reactivity?
I am.
What is that?
So emotional reactivity is very common in the diagnosis. So essentially, like I said, there's instability in emotions. People with borderline personality disorder are often misdiagnosed as having bipolar disorder because they can be up and down. They can look very depressed and they can look very elated, but these changes are happening within a matter of hours. Somebody with bipolar disorder, this is a clinical depression lasting days, weeks, a clinical mania where sometimes they even need to be hospitalized because they're so grandiose. They clear out their bank account and go to Vegas and spend it all. They're acting in some very bizarre ways. With borderline personality disorder, you're having these fluctuating moods constantly. And again, this hypersensitivity to being slighted or feeling offended, really driven by the fear that if you're offended or slighted, if the therapist comes in 2 minutes late, or if somebody shows up to dinner 2 minutes late, that they might be abandoning you. And it's not as if the borderline is considering themselves abandoned in that moment, but they just know that they have this overwhelming emotion and there are no attempts to control that emotion. There are no attempts to regulate it. So if they're in the middle of the restaurant and they feel offended, they're going to start the fight. People are going to see it, or they might just start crying or break down, but they'll make a lot of accusations, and that reactivity is when you're going to see a lot of this escalation of bizarre behavior. They can react violently, they can react aggressively, they will often physically prevent their partner from trying to leave if their partner wants to get space from all of this intense emotion. And oftentimes they will be abusive to their partners in these situations. Sometimes they'll physically restrain them from leaving and become injured that way, but also people with borderline personality disorder, it seems to be a predictive factor for women who implement violence against their partner. And one of the most common tactics that they'll use is actually physically assaulting and then getting harmed themselves. But mostly, we call this administrative violence. So essentially, this is saying that they'll make threats using the legal system. So they might say that they are going to file a restraining order or claim abuse, or they might do these things to essentially try to keep their partner from leaving. In the moment, again, they're not consciously thinking, I'm going to keep my partner from leaving right now. They're just thinking, I can't stand this. I hate my partner. They went from idealizing to suddenly devaluing because of the hurt, and they'll do anything to express that big emotion of anger.
Your Honor, may we approach?
All right, Mr.
Okay. You indicated you were talking about emotional reactivity. What, if any, emotional reactivity did you observe in your review? Let's do this one at a time.
Okay. So there were a couple indications to me. First, I can sort of think about it with the treatment record. So particularly Dr. Cohen-Connell's, am I getting the name right? I feel like for some reason in my mind I might have just reversed it. But Dr. Cohen's records, I did reverse it. He actually refers to this reactivity quite a bit and to Ms. Hurd's temper. And that temper, it's often branded, or being hot-headed, is really characteristic of borderline personality disorder. As is their very charming, personable nature. This is a disorder of contradictions. In Nurse Bilotti's notes, I thought there was something interesting. She references a night when they're out to dinner, I believe in London, and she provided positive reinforcement to Ms. Hurd because Ms. Hurd had been disappointed by a mistake made by the server, and it sort of references how previously she might have criticized the server and become upset by that, and that she didn't this time, and so that had been some sort of a step forward. And there was also an indication actually in Dr. Hughes's, Dr. Hughes is a forensic psychologist who had been appointed by Ms. Hurd to conduct as an evaluation as well. In Ms. Hughes's interview of Ms. Hurd disclosed that she had cut her arm in the past, which is a typical reactive type thing somebody with this diagnosis can do. It's one of the symptoms. And that's sort of all I can think of top of my mind from the treatment records. Moving into some of the declarations or deposition testimony, what struck me was Ms. Raquel Pennington's testimony. She's a former friend of Ms. Hurd's, and she told a story about, I suppose they were shopping for Thanksgiving accoutrements, something to prepare for Thanksgiving, and Ms. Hurd struck her in the face, sort of out of the blue, which is, I thought was interesting because that is one of those signs of borderline personality disorder where if if a friend or a loved one isn't meeting your needs in that moment, people with borderline personality disorder can be very caring in their relationships as long as their needs are being met. They feel that their needs should be met when they want them met at a specific level, and if they're not, then that anger, that sense of harm, causes them to react. So the striking Ms. Pennington's report in the declaration or the testimony, I thought was pretty consistent. And then Ms. Hurd's own self-description.
Okay, we're gonna ask you a question about,
Sure.
You indicated Miss Pennington was a former friend
Yes.
of Miss Hurd. Is there a relationship between borderline personality disorder and intimate relationships?
Yes. So the instability definitely translates to their relationships. You'll see relationships start very intensely. People will, somebody with borderline personality disorder perceives the relationship as extremely close. This pattern of idealizing and devaluing is definitely at play. They do this with their lovers and also with their friends. And so this might be the perfect person, their perfect soulmate friend, perfect soulmate partner, and their engagement in the relationship is very alluring, very charming to the other person. And so initially everything seems great. But what occurs is that reality sets in. People are not perfect, even when we have a lot in common with them. Whereas most of us can accept somebody as a whole, somebody who has a little bit of flaws, and still think this is my great friend who always constantly running late for dinner. The person with borderline personality disorder, things are in these extremes. It's black and white. We call it splitting. And so that person goes from being idealized, the perfect person, to dumpster. They are totally devalued. They are the worst friend. They don't care anything about me. I have better people around. And then there will be a repair because the person with this disorder does feel remorseful after they have these reactions, angry, tell their friend off. But over time, it wears away at these relationships. And so what you'll usually see is many, many transitions in their friendships over the years, people who have sort of fallen by the wayside, who were really very close knit at one time, and then, but there's not a lot of consistency in the long term. You'll also see that with their intimate relationships, many, many relationships, but none that are particularly long term.
How does borderline personality disorder relate to identity issues?
So again, that instability also travels toward identity. When I was describing personality earlier, I was talking a little bit about those traits we have that help us know who we are. When you have borderline personality disorder, that actually is not something you understand. So people with this disorder actually take on the identity of the people they're spending time with because it's comforting. It's very uncomfortable to not know who you are. Some people with this disorder will describe a feeling of emptiness when they feel like they've been abandoned because now they don't know who they are in the world. And so when somebody with this disorder is going through that initial enmeshment phase with new people and they're idealizing them, they often will take on the identities of those people. So they may mimic them in a lot of ways. They might mimic the way they dress, their interests, the way they talk. And for this reason, the people around somebody with this disorder kind of from the outside may feel like, wait, I thought you were this way. Now you're advocating for this, and this is your new main interest in life, or the thing you're throwing yourself into all completely. Music tastes might change, hobbies will change, the way they dress.
In addition to borderline personality disorder, I understand that you diagnosed another personality disorder. What's that?
So histrionic personality disorder. And these are really two sides of the same coin. They belong to the same cluster. We call these clusters. It's a way to organize personality disorders in that DSM. And this cluster is described as the personality disorders that are dramatic, erratic, and emotional. Okay, so unpredictable, but really having to do with emotions and relationships. They're very similar. Whereas I was saying that borderline personality disorder, a lot of the key features that you're going to notice are instability. When it comes to histrionic, a lot of the key features are going to be drama and shallowness. Similarly, with borderline personality disorder, there's this underlying drive of avoiding abandonment. With histrionic personality disorder, that underlying drive is to always be the center of attention. Because if you don't have that attention on you, it feels similarly to borderline personality disorder. You feel pretty empty, like you don't have that sense of being or value. Okay, so whereas borderline personality disorder might have more of the visible reactivity if somebody seems to be leaving, with histrionic personality disorder, what you're going to see is extreme discomfort with not being the center of attention, extreme efforts to be the center of attention. And when they feel that they're not the center of attention, you will see some strange things, making up stories to try to get attention, often taking on a victim or princess role. Those two roles in particular are pretty consistent. Seeking caretaking. Borderline personality disorder is similar because with borderline personality disorder, there's shifts of identity and splitting. You might see somebody go from being, in the DSM, it describes it as a needy supplicant of help, seeking the perfect caretaker, to suddenly being the avenger against injustice or thinking that their partner is a terrible person. With histrionic, what you'll see is somebody who wants to be the center of attention, has sort of that impressionistic speech, very flowery, very enthusiastic, but nothing's really being said. The moment your attention wears away, because they're so demanding for attention, that's when they might take the victim role or the princess role and even make up stories. Sometimes those stories are to bolster the victim role. Sometimes those stories are just to make them look more interesting or accomplished in their mind so that they can get respect and attention that way.
Is there a relation between histrionic personality disorder and attractiveness?
There is, strangely, and this is always one of the trickiest things to talk about. How is that a symptom? But characteristically, people with this disorder are very, very interested in looks, but more importantly, they utilize their looks to get that attention, to get that respect that they're seeking. And so this type of a personality might be flirtatious with everybody. Characteristically, they actually can even be subtly, and when I say flirtatious, I'm not talking overtly sexy, but inappropriately flattering. Sometimes they act in a kind of a girlish way to be cute and to engender attention. And this will even occur in their therapy relationships as a way to sort of avoid getting negative feedback or criticism. Oftentimes they'll bring the therapist gifts or be distracting if they engage in therapy because they just don't want any criticism. They want the therapist to like them.
Does the intelligence of the affected person bear on the manner in which these disorders present?
Excuse me, I choked a little bit water. Yes, and I think one way to think about it that's probably a little more accurate than just intelligence is, in psychology, we would describe this more as sophistication. So street smart, so to speak. The way, for instance, I've had many clients who have borderline personality disorder who are messy and really clearly suffering, and they might be difficult and all over the place and yell at you in the middle of a session, but it's so it's not tailored. It's so much easier to work with because of that just openness and rawness of it, genuineness. Sometimes you'll have a more sophisticated presentation. There are 9 symptoms and only 5 have to be met. There are a lot of different combinations and different ways it can present. And sometimes you'll have more of a petulant version of this where it really shows when you push the button and you're kind of, whoa, what was that? So somebody who's really productive, high functioning, successful, and you get to know them and you think they're fantastic because they're so interested in you too. And you might not realize it, but they're mimicking you perfectly. So you're really just kind of falling in love with this new friend who is being you. But then all of a sudden, you say something that they think is offensive, and you can't, even in your wildest thoughts, understand how that could have offended somebody, but their reaction is so strong that you kind of buy into it. Gosh, maybe I did say something offensive, and you feel bad about it. So that sophisticated version, they can be a little bit more calculated in the way they present. They tend to kind of hit you where it hurts a little bit more, and they can be actually very, very destructive.
What conclusions were you able to draw about Miss Heard's sophistication from her testing?
Well, from her testing and from her presentation, she was very likable, but her testing in particular showed that she approached it in a manner that, remember I told you about those scales that are pretty neat. She approached it in a manner that very clearly minimized any psychological dysfunction. Not just that, but really presented herself as free of any problems. And she did so in a way that was very, very sophisticated, not obvious, by responding to questions that most people might not notice were trying to detect that.
How did you determine that?
So that's based on a particular scale on the MMPI-2 that is designed specifically to detect a type of responding that's a little bit more clever, a little bit more sophisticated, minimizing problems in a way that most lay people probably wouldn't understand, and even providers, very difficult to detect.
You mentioned that one of the characteristics of borderline personality disorder is emotional reactivity. How might that present in an intimate relationship?
So I think it probably presents mostly, or you'd see the bulk of it in intimate relationships because of that regular interaction and the desire for your partner to meet all of your needs, to be the perfect caretaker. Also that the hallmark of the disorder with the splitting, so idealizing, devaluing, and the perceiving of all sorts of neutral events as somehow demeaning or disrespectful. It's regular escalations of anger, frustrated complaints, criticisms of your partner. But because the person with borderline personality disorder, first of all, they're more sensitive to things, they feel distress more strongly, and then that distress lasts longer. So these types of blow-ups go on forever, and they're very cyclic. It feels like you just can't get a resolution, and eventually the partner will try to leave, will want to leave to take a break. It wears them down, and that's when the borderline might explode and act very aggressively or violently to try to prevent them from leaving.
In addition to diagnosing Ms. Heard with these two personality disorders, did you form another opinion about Ms. Heard's mental status?
Yes, so I'm not, there, go ahead.
If the answer to that is yes, I'm going to now ask.
Okay,
what was
yes,
that?
I did.
Okay, what is it?
So in addition to looking for Ms. Heard's general mental status, any psychological issues that were present, I very specifically was assessing to determine whether post-traumatic stress disorder was present, and it was not.
How do you know that?
So first of all, from multiple information sources, right? So I was integrating the interview, my review of the data, the case records, other people's testimony, her treatment records. And then I also conducted, in addition to the MMPI-2 and looking at that data, I also conducted the clinician-administered PTSD scale, the CAPS-5, which is the gold standard PTSD assessment developed by the National Center for PTSD, shown to be valid, accurate for use not just with service members, but also with civilians, men, women, all genders, and also all ethnicities, and then also specifically for use in a courtroom setting.
How do you conduct the CAPS 5?
So the CAPS 5 is a standard interview. What that means is that it's an interview with very clear questions that are scripted, and you ask those same questions every time you test a person. So because you're doing that, you're actually taking something that would typically be kind of subjective, an interview with somebody, and you're making it more objective. When you ask those same questions in the same way, every time somebody's assessed with this, now you can apply a scoring protocol and actually score their responses.
As a result of applying those protocols, what did you conclude?
Ms. Hurd did not have PTSD, and there were also pretty significant indications that she was grossly exaggerating symptoms of PTSD when asked about them.
How did you make that latter conclusion?
So one of the strengths of this test, as I mentioned, the important thing about any test used when you're doing an evaluation in forensics is to make sure that the person is responding accurately. And this test does that by not just asking people whether they have a symptom, but asking follow-up questions that draw out very detailed accounts of every single symptom of PTSD. And when you're really familiar with this disorder, which you need to be to administer this test, there are nuances in the way a person will describe their symptoms that have been shown repeatedly to indicate exaggeration or faking. There are also indications when somebody is clearly giving you a genuine response.
What, if any, symptoms of PTSD did you observe in Ms. Hurd?
So there are 20 kind of core symptoms that somebody can manifest with PTSD. You don't have to have all of them. Ms. Hurd initially said that she had, in the first question, you say, do you ever have this? Before you get to the more nuanced follow-up questions. When I asked that first question on each item, she initially said, yes, I have that, to 19 of the 20 symptoms. That's not typical even of somebody with the most disabling form of PTSD. When we eventually sort of dialed it down, she had 3 remaining symptoms. And having symptoms of any disorder is common for all of us. Some of us struggle with sleep. Some of us get anxious. It could be several different disorders. It could just be that you have this struggle in your life. But she had 3 specific symptoms that I scored as present. Off the top of my head, I might miss one, but one was sleep disturbance. So she reported that she has frequent nightmares. Another one was that she said that she tends to have a startle response. So if she gets startled or surprised, she tends to stay in sort of a hyper startle mode for quite a while. And that's consistent with a couple of things. It can be consistent with PTSD if other criteria are met. It's also consistent with childhood complex trauma, which is something that can occur when your brain is forming. If you constantly feel unsafe, if your parents are abusive, or if they're not present, if you're neglected, you can develop certain physiological responses that can stay for a long time in your life. So I noted that would seem like a very genuine, accurate account where she stays in the state of kind of hyper arousal, has a hard time calming down if she gets surprised.
You mentioned nightmares as well.
Yes.
Did she recount for you the nature of the nightmares?
So they were vague. She indicated that she has recurrent nightmares and that she feels as though she's being held down. And there was some conflict in that account because even though that could be a PTSD symptom, it is fairly vague, but I still scored it as present. And in her initial treatment with with Dr. Bonnie Jacobs, which I believe started before she began dating Mr. Depp, she had indicated to Dr. Jacobs, according to Dr. Jacobs's notes, that she was having repetitive nightmares back then and that they were related to her childhood trauma. And so that came up several times in the notes. Dr. Jacobs kept mentioning that.
Thank you. What is feigning?
Feigning is essentially faking or exaggerating symptoms that aren't present.
Does the CAPS-5 control for that?
It doesn't necessarily control for it, it can expose it by
And
drawing out
how does that work?
because you're not just simply handing the person a checklist that says, here are all the symptoms of PTSD, why don't just check off the ones you have, which clearly if you're trying to look like you have PTSD, you would just check them all. The CAPS-5, because it requires them to describe in detail how they experience the symptom, where it shows up, what it looks like, what sort of examples they can give you, how many times it's happened in the last couple of weeks, how many times it's happened in the last month. By the end of each symptom, you've gotten a very good picture of a couple things. One, does it meet the definition of the symptom? Are they getting it right, right? Is this actually the symptom, or are they kind of confusing this with something else? Number two, are they giving you very vague counts? Are they giving you kind of a stereotyped idea of what the symptom is based on media or movies or something that actually is completely different from genuine experiences of this symptom? Or are they giving you a very genuine, heartfelt, sometimes minimizing, but it's ticking all the boxes, their mannerisms while they're describing it, the actual very specific, very nuanced, symbolic ways they're describing it. A lot of times it smells, it sounds, that all appears in genuine accounts, and it's something that people really get wrong when they're feigning.
In addition to your conclusion that Ms. Heard does not have PTSD, did you make a conclusion with respect to her symptoms?
Yes, actually I did. So, just because somebody doesn't have PTSD doesn't mean that they weren't harmed psychologically by whatever is being alleged. In this case, Ms. Heard is alleging that she was psychologically harmed and that she suffered PTSD because of abuse that she alleges occurred by Mr. Depp. So the MMPI too is helpful because it shows you kind of everything, any other symptoms. And then in Ms. Heard's own self-report and her prior treatment records, I knew that she had reported to me that she had had some other symptoms. So now what becomes really important is determining, and let me clarify one thing here, not so much a diagnosis, but did she start to experience symptoms during the relationship and after? Did they worsen after? Or could these types of symptoms or reports be explained by other factors? A, by feigning, B, by pre-existing conditions, or C, by other stressful life events that might have occurred. So the main symptoms that I was looking at didn't meet criteria for PTSD, right? There was also, substantial evidence of this sort of emotional dysregulation, emotional disorganization, the shallowness, the dramatic affect. Now, when you have a lot of childhood trauma, you can actually have some similar type presentation in adulthood. There are some differences though, but also that's not something that would have occurred after this relationship. So now I was looking at, are there indications that these types of things that she's described, this transient anxiety, the issues with sleep, were these there prior? And sure enough, Ms. Heard, in her own self-report, stated to me that when she first got to LA, she was seeking treatment for, in her words, blanket anxiety and depression. She also reported that she was taking medications. In general, none of them were helpful. That's actually very typical of borderline personality disorder. Medications typically aren't very helpful for somebody with a disorder. They really need an intensive, lifelong type of therapy, which is not necessarily as relevant to this. But interestingly also, people with borderline personality disorder often respond really positively to stimulant medications that are given for ADD or ADHD. And one of Nurse Filati's notes, she reported that Ms. Heard told her that none of the medications were working for her except for one Provigil, which is often prescribed as stimulant medication. And I just thought that was interesting and sort of consistent with more of these lifelong personality disorders that aren't necessarily caused by a harm by any allegations, but have been there and will remain there typically. The other issue, so the anxiety, she had already indicated that had been there prior, but the form of the anxiety. So looking at Dr. Hughes's testing and then also looking at the scores on the MMPI, when you look at all these little combinations of the scores, you can actually learn a lot about, is the anxiety related to an event, or is this more a person who tends to be an anxious person regardless of what's going on in their life? And somebody might describe them as a worrywart. And the scores, the little combination of scores that she obtained actually indicated that it was the latter, that her anxiety tends to be separate from events and more just kind of a constant, and it comes and goes, but it's more of a trait.
I have no further questions for Ms. Wiggins.
All right. Maybe why don't we go ahead and, Ms. Burnett, go ahead and have our lunch break. It might be a good idea to break it up there. Okay, I know, I can see you jumping up. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, let's go ahead and take our lunch recess. Just again, do not do any outside research and don't discuss the case with anybody, okay? We'll have you back here.
Now look, she learned to stand. Okay, if you're watching live on TikTok, we are only coming back on YouTube after lunch. I repeat, if you are watching live on TikTok, we are only going live after lunch on YouTube. So if you want to join us, look at the bottom of the screen right here. It's
And
the
again,
Sojo
Dr.
Files
Casey,
on
with your
YouTube.
testimony, please do not discuss your testimony with anybody at this time, okay? All right, let's just, when we come back at 1:50. Okay?
Again,
Come back at
TikTok,
1:50.
switch to YouTube after lunch, and we will pick up after lunch. Ooh, okay, anything we want to hash out before we take our quick lunch break? Anything, real quick before we take lunch. We'll take lunch, then we'll come back. Did anyone catch what time lunch was over? 1. Okay, 1:15. Thank you, Jesse. Okay, so we are going to take a quick lunch break. Go stuff. Oh, 1:50. Thank you. Dyslexic here. Okay. What? Can't click on the right comment. Jesus. Okay. Do we need to hash anything out really quick before we take our lunch break? Because you know a bitch gets hangry and I'm going to have to woof some food down. Refill my coffee. Anything we want to hash out real quick? You know I'm going to be eating some oatmeal cream pies. I got to eat that to go, that quick food. Okay. Let everybody go refill their mega pints of coffee or wine because it will be post-lunch. I'm not judging. Eat something, get your petty vibes going. We will reconvene at 1:50 right here. I will see you guys at 1:50. Sorry, I was reading the last one. Okay. Go eat, refill, take a grumpy, whatever you need to do. See you guys at 1:50.